It was a chilly evening in New York City, and the streets were alive with the usual chaos of honking cars, flashing billboards, and hurried pedestrians. Inside a luxurious penthouse overlooking Central Park, James Crawford sat in his leather armchair, sipping a glass of whiskey. He was a man who had everything: money, power, and influence. His business empire, built on real estate investments, had made him one of the wealthiest men in the city. But despite all his success, his heart was filled with arrogance, and his mind was poisoned by the belief that love was secondary to wealth. His wife, Emily, stood by the fireplace, nervously twisting the hem of her dress. She had been trying to gather the courage to tell him the news for days, but every time she looked into his cold, calculating eyes, she hesitated. Tonight, however, she could wait no longer. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. "James, I have something to tell you," she said softly. James barely acknowledged her, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Go ahead," he said, his tone indifferent. "I'm pregnant," she whispered, her voice trembling. For a moment there was silence. James placed his glass on the table and turned his gaze toward her, his expression unreadable. Then, instead of joy or excitement, a smirk spread across his face. "Pregnant?" he repeated, almost mockingly. "And I suppose you expect me to believe this child is mine?" Emily's heart sank. "James, what are you saying? Of course it's yours. We've been married for 3 years. Why would I lie about this?" James stood up abruptly, his towering figure casting a shadow over her. "Don't play innocent, Emily. My mother warned me about you from the start. She said you were just after my money, and now you're proving her right." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes. "Your mother? James, your mother has never liked me. She always wanted you to marry someone from your own social circle. But I loved you for who you were, not for your money." James let out a bitter laugh. "Love? Don't make me laugh. I see it now. You think this baby will secure your place in my life, that you'll have a permanent claim to my wealth." Emily shook her head in disbelief. "I don't want your money, James. I just wanted to share this joy with you. I thought you would be happy." James took a step closer, his face inches from hers. "I don't trust you, Emily. And I won't let you trap me with a child." Her hands instinctively went to her stomach, as if protecting the life growing inside her. "James, please don't do this," she pleaded. "This is our child." But James had made up his mind. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a checkbook. "Here," he said, scribbling a number. "Take this and leave. You'll never have to worry about money again." Emily stared at the check, horrified. "You think I can be bought?" she said, her voice breaking. "You think I would trade my child for a piece of paper?" James's face hardened. "If you don't want the money, then leave with nothing. But you're not staying here. Pack your things and get out." The finality in his voice sent a chill down Emily's spine. She realized then that the man she had married no longer existed, if he ever had. Without another word, she turned and walked to the bedroom, tears streaming down her face. She packed a small bag, her hands trembling. This was her home, the place where she had built dreams with him. And now she was being thrown out like a stranger. When she stepped out of the room, James was standing by the door, his arms crossed. "Don't ever come back," he said coldly. Emily looked at him one last time, hoping to see even a flicker of regret in his eyes. But there was none. With a heavy heart, she turned and walked out into the freezing night. She had nowhere to go. Her family was in Chicago, miles away, and she had no friends in the city. She wandered the streets of Manhattan, the neon lights and bustling crowds a cruel contrast to the emptiness she felt inside. She clutched her stomach, whispering, "I'll take care of you, my baby. No matter what, I won't let you suffer." As the hours passed, the reality of her situation sank in. She had no home, no money, and no one to turn to. But she had something far more valuable: her determination. She refused to let James's cruelty break her. She would survive. She would raise her child with love, even if she had to do it alone. Little did she know that 20 years later, fate would bring her back to the man who had abandoned her. But this time the tables would be turned. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. Emily shivered as she walked through the streets of New York City, the biting wind cutting through her thin coat. The towering skyscrapers, once symbols of excitement and dreams, now felt suffocating. Her whole life had collapsed in a matter of hours. The man she had loved, the one she had trusted with her heart, had thrown her out without hesitation. She wrapped her arms around her stomach protectively, feeling the slight swell of her pregnancy. She had no home, no money, and nowhere to go. The realization was overwhelming, but she refused to break down. She had to think. She had to survive for her child. As the night deepened, Emily walked aimlessly through the streets, looking for a place to rest. She wandered into Grand Central Terminal, finding a bench in a quieter corner. She sat down, exhausted, her body aching from the hours of walking. Around her, travelers rushed to catch their trains, their lives moving forward while hers had come to a screeching halt. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to block out the noise, but sleep wouldn't come. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, reminding her she hadn't eaten since the morning. But food required money and she had none. By morning she knew she couldn't stay in New York. The city was too expensive, and every street reminded her of James. She needed a fresh start. She thought of her old college friend Rachel, who lived in Chicago. They had lost touch over the years, but Rachel had always been kind-hearted. It was a long shot, but Emily had no other options. She made her way to Port Authority bus terminal, her hands trembling as she approached the ticket counter. The clerk barely looked up. Next, he called, bored. I need a bus ticket to Chicago, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. One way or round trip? He asked. Emily hesitated. A round trip would mean she had a place to return to. But there was nothing left for her in New York. One way, she murmured. That'll be $120, the clerk said, tapping at his screen. Emily's stomach dropped. She had nothing. Absolutely nothing. She stepped aside, her mind racing. She had never begged in her life, but what choice did she have? She took a deep breath and approached a middle-aged woman who looked kind. Excuse me, she said hesitantly. I'm in a really bad situation. I need to get to Chicago and I don't have the money for a bus ticket. If you could spare anything. The woman's eyes darted away, uncomfortable. I'm sorry I can't help, she muttered, walking away quickly. Emily swallowed hard and tried again. She asked an elderly man, a businessman in a sharp suit, a young couple holding hands. The responses were the same: pity, avoidance, rejection. Her cheeks burned with shame. She was about to give up when she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to see a tall, lanky man with kind eyes. He looked like he had seen his fair share of hardships. Chicago, huh? He said. I grew up there. How much do you need? $120, she said, embarrassed. The man nodded and pulled out his wallet. He handed her the exact amount without hesitation. I've been where you are, he said simply. Just promise me you'll pay it forward when you can. Tears filled Emily's eyes. I will, she promised. Thank you. You have no idea what this means to me. An hour later, she was on the bus, watching the city disappear behind her. As the miles stretched on, she thought about what lay ahead. She didn't know if Rachel would take her in. She didn't know how she would survive. But for the first time since James had thrown her out, she felt a glimmer of hope. When the bus pulled into Chicago the next morning, Emily felt a wave of nervousness. She had memorized Rachel's last known address from an old Christmas card but had no phone to call ahead. She stepped off the bus, taking a deep breath. The air was crisp and the city buzzed with life. Chicago was different from New York, less polished but somehow warmer. She hailed a cab with the last of her money and gave Rachel's address. As the car wove through the city streets, she tried to calm her nerves. When they reached a modest apartment building in Lincoln Park, Emily hesitated. What if Rachel had moved? What if she didn't remember her? Summoning her courage, she knocked on the door. Seconds felt like hours before it finally opened. Rachel stood there, her eyes widening in shock. Emily? She gasped. Tears spilled down Emily's cheeks. I didn't know where else to go, she admitted. Rachel took one look at her. Her worn-out clothes, her tired eyes, the way she clutched her stomach, and without hesitation pulled her into a hug. Come inside, she said firmly. The warmth of the apartment enveloped Emily as she stepped in. It was small but cozy, filled with books and framed pictures. The scent of fresh coffee filled the air. Rachel led her to the couch and handed her a blanket. Tell me everything, she said, concern etched on her face. Emily took a shaky breath and began to speak. She told Rachel about James, the pregnancy, the way he had thrown her out without a second thought. Rachel listened in silence, her eyes darkening with anger. That bastard, she muttered when Emily finished. You deserve so much better. Emily wiped her tears. I don't know what to do, Rachel. I have no job, no home. I can't raise this baby on the streets. Rachel took her hand. You're not alone. You can stay here as long as you need. And we'll figure things out together. For the first time in days, Emily felt a weight lift from her chest. She wasn't alone. She had a friend. And maybe, just maybe, she had a chance to rebuild her life. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. Days turned into weeks, and Emily slowly began adjusting to her new reality in Chicago. Rachel's small apartment became her safe haven, a place where she could breathe without fear of being thrown out. Every morning she would wake up to the smell of freshly brewed coffee, the sound of city traffic filtering through the windows, and the comforting presence of Rachel, who had become more than just an old friend. She was now family. But despite the warmth and kindness Rachel offered, Emily knew she couldn't rely on her forever. She had to stand on her own feet, find a way to support herself, and most importantly, prepare for the arrival of her child. Her first challenge was finding a job. With no savings and no college degree, her options were limited. She spent her days walking through the streets of downtown Chicago, filling out applications at cafes, diners, and retail stores. Rejections came swiftly, some polite, others dismissive. "We're looking for someone with experience," they would say, or "we're not hiring right now." It was discouraging, but she refused to give up. One afternoon, after hours of job hunting, she stopped at a small diner in River North. The place smelled of grilled burgers and freshly baked pies. The sign on the window read "Help Wanted." Desperate, she walked in and approached the counter. A middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a tired expression looked up from wiping a coffee mug. "What can I get you?" she asked. "I saw the sign outside," Emily said nervously. "Are you still hiring?" The woman studied her for a moment. "You ever worked in a restaurant before?" Emily shook her head. "No, but I'm a fast learner. I really need this job." The woman sighed, setting the mug down. "It's not easy work. The pay isn't great and the customers can be rude. Think you can handle that?" Emily nodded eagerly. "I'll do whatever it takes." The woman, who introduced herself as Margaret, the owner, gave Emily a skeptical look before handing her an apron. "Fine. You start tomorrow. Morning shift. Don't be late." Emily could have cried with relief. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That night, she shared the news with Rachel, who hugged her tightly. "See? You're already making progress," she said with a smile. The next morning, Emily arrived early, determined to prove herself. The diner was a modest place, frequented by truck drivers, office workers, and locals who had been coming there for years. The work was exhausting, taking orders, refilling coffee cups, clearing tables, but for the first time in weeks, Emily felt a sense of purpose. She wasn't just surviving, she was fighting for a better future. As days passed, she started saving every dollar she could. She cut back on expenses, eating only what Rachel cooked at home and walking instead of taking buses. But even with the job, she knew she needed more. Pregnancy came with medical bills, and soon there would be diapers, clothes, and all the expenses of raising a child. One evening, after finishing a long shift, she sat across from Rachel at their small kitchen table. "I need to do more," she admitted. "This job isn't enough." Rachel, who had been grading papers from her teaching job, looked up thoughtfully. "Have you thought about taking night classes? Maybe something that could help you get a better job?" Emily sighed. "I don't have the time or money for that." Rachel tapped her pen against the table. "What about community programs? There are organizations in the city that help single mothers. Some offer scholarships, job training, things that could help you in the long run." The idea sparked hope in Emily. The next day, she visited the Chicago Women's Resource Center, where she met a counselor named Linda. She explained her situation, and Linda listened carefully before handing her a list of programs. "You're not alone in this," she assured Emily. "There are people who want to help." One of the programs caught Emily's eye, a training course for medical office assistants. It was short, affordable, and promised steady job opportunities. She signed up immediately, determined to build a stable future for her child. As the weeks passed, her belly grew, and so did her determination. She balanced work, classes, and doctor's appointments, pushing through exhaustion because she knew every effort was for her child. Margaret at the diner noticed her dedication and began treating her with more respect, occasionally slipping her extra food to take home. Rachel remained her rock, cheering her on during the toughest days. One evening, as she sat in her room folding baby clothes Rachel had bought from a second-hand store, she felt a sudden flutter in her stomach. She froze, placing a hand over the small bump. And then she felt it again, a tiny, unmistakable kick. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "You're really in there, aren't you?" It was the first moment she truly felt connected to her baby, and it filled her with a love so strong it drowned out all the pain James had caused. Meanwhile, across the country, James Crawford continued his life of luxury in New York, completely unaware of the woman he had discarded. His business empire had only grown, his name appearing in Forbes articles and finance magazines. Women came and went, none lasting long enough to matter. He had convinced himself that he had done the right thing, that Emily had been nothing more than a mistake. He never once wondered about the child he had abandoned. But fate had its way of bringing people back together, and James had no idea that 20 years later, Emily would walk back into his life, not as the broken woman he had left behind, but as someone far stronger than he could have ever imagined. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. Emily's life in Chicago had transformed in ways she never imagined. Months turned into years, and she had built something stable not just for herself, but for her son, Daniel. From the moment he was born at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, she knew she had a purpose greater than any pain James had inflicted on her. Holding him in her arms for the first time, his tiny fingers wrapped around hers, she made a silent promise. She would never let him feel abandoned the way she had. The early years were the hardest. She worked long hours, sometimes double shifts at the diner, while also completing her training as a medical office assistant. Rachel remained by her side, helping care for Daniel when Emily's schedule became overwhelming. Some nights, Emily would come home exhausted, her body aching, but the moment she saw her baby's sleepy smile, everything felt worth it. By the time Daniel was 5, Emily had secured a full-time job at a pediatric clinic in Lincoln Park, finally leaving the diner behind. It was a small victory but a significant one. The steady paycheck meant she could afford a better apartment, a tiny but cozy 2-bedroom space in a safe neighborhood. Life was still far from easy, but it was stable. She made sure Daniel had everything he needed: books, warm clothes, and even little treats from time to time. Emily rarely thought about James. In the early days, she had moments of anger, times when she wondered if he ever regretted what he had done. But as years passed, she realized that dwelling on him was a waste of energy. He had chosen to erase them from his life, and she had chosen to build a new one. Daniel grew up into a bright and compassionate boy. He had Emily's dark hair and determined spirit, but his sharp blue eyes were unmistakably his father's. Emily never hid the truth from him. She told him that his father had left before he was born, that he was a powerful businessman in New York, but she never spoke with bitterness. "Some people make choices they can't undo," she would say. "But that doesn't define who you are." Daniel never asked much about James. To him, his mother was his whole world. He admired her strength, her resilience, and the way she always managed to smile, no matter how tired she was. By the time Daniel turned 18, he had become everything Emily had dreamed of: a responsible, ambitious young man with a sharp mind and a heart full of kindness. He had been accepted into Columbia University, a moment that filled Emily with both pride and fear. Letting him go was the hardest thing she had ever done, but she knew he deserved the best opportunities. On the day she dropped him off in New York City, she hugged him tightly, whispering, "Go make your mark on the world, my love." He promised to call every day, and as she watched him disappear into the crowd of students, she felt both the weight of her sacrifices and the beauty of what they had built together. Meanwhile, James Crawford's life had gone in a different direction. His success in real estate had reached new heights, making him one of the wealthiest men in New York. But success had come at a cost. Over the years, he had married twice, both times ending in bitter divorces. He had children from both marriages, but they barely spoke to him. His empire had given him wealth beyond measure, but no real happiness. He had always dismissed the past, burying memories of Emily deep within him, believing that what he had done had been necessary. He told himself he had moved on, that she was nothing more than a chapter he had closed long ago. But fate had its own plans. One evening, as Daniel walked through Manhattan, excited about his new life, he found himself in front of a massive skyscraper with the name Crawford Enterprises plastered in bold letters. He had heard the name before. His mother had mentioned it when he was younger. Curiosity burned within him, and for the first time in his life, he felt an overwhelming urge to know more about the man who had abandoned them. With a racing heart, he pulled out his phone and began searching for information. Article after article painted the image of a ruthless businessman, a man admired for his wealth but criticized for his lack of empathy. As Daniel scrolled through images of James Crawford, he felt an unsettling mix of emotions. This was the man who had chosen power over family, a man who had walked away without looking back. That night, Daniel called Emily. "Mom," he said carefully, "do you ever wonder if he regrets it?" There was silence on the other end. Emily knew exactly who he was talking about. She took a deep breath before answering. "Maybe," she said softly. "But I stopped wondering a long time ago." Daniel didn't respond right away. His mother had moved on, but something inside him needed closure. He didn't know what he was looking for, a confrontation, an apology, or simply an acknowledgement that he existed. Over the next few weeks, he researched everything he could about James Crawford. The more he learned, the more conflicted he felt. His father had built a kingdom, but at what cost? Stories of failed marriages, estranged children, and ruthless business dealings painted a picture of a man who had everything but seemed to have nothing at all. One afternoon, while walking near Wall Street, Daniel made a bold decision. He entered the towering Crawford Enterprises building, his heart pounding. The receptionist, a well-dressed woman in her 40s, looked up. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. "No," Daniel admitted. "But I need to see Mr. Crawford. It's important." The woman raised an eyebrow. "And who are you?" Daniel hesitated for only a second before saying the words that had been stuck in his throat for years. "I'm his son." Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. The receptionist at Crawford Enterprises stared at Daniel for a long moment, her polished demeanor faltering just slightly. There was skepticism in her eyes, but also something else, curiosity. She looked him over, as if assessing whether this young man standing before her could possibly be telling the truth. Daniel felt a strange mix of emotions. He had walked into this building on impulse, without a plan, without an idea of what he expected to happen. And now, standing here, claiming his identity, it suddenly felt real in a way it never had before. He was James Crawford's son. The man who had abandoned his mother, the man who had erased them from his life, was sitting somewhere in this massive glass tower, completely unaware that the past was about to knock on his door. The receptionist finally cleared her throat. "Do you have any identification?" she asked, her voice professional but laced with suspicion. Daniel hesitated, then pulled out his driver's license. She glanced at the name, but it told her nothing. He had his mother's last name, of course. "Wait here," she said, standing up. She disappeared through a sleek glass door, leaving Daniel alone in the grand lobby, surrounded by the silent hum of success. He looked around, taking in the towering ceilings, the massive artwork, the carefully curated elegance of it all. This was the world his father had built, the world he had chosen over family. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Daniel shifted on his feet, his heart pounding harder with each passing second. Just as he was about to reconsider his decision, the glass door opened again. This time, a man in a dark suit emerged, a security officer, tall and broad-shouldered. His expression was unreadable as he approached Daniel. "Mr. Crawford will see you," he said, his voice firm but neutral. "Follow me." Daniel swallowed hard and nodded. He followed the man through a maze of glass-walled offices and marble hallways, his palms sweating despite the cool air. Finally, they stopped in front of a massive wooden door. The security officer pushed it open, revealing a vast office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. Behind a sleek black desk sat a man Daniel had only seen in news articles and interviews. James Crawford. His father. James looked up from his laptop, his piercing blue eyes that Daniel saw every day in his own reflection, narrowing slightly. He was older than the photos suggested, with streaks of gray in his hair and lines on his face that hinted at years of stress. But he still carried himself with the same aura of power and control that had made him a legend in the business world. For a moment, he simply studied Daniel, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice that was both sharp and detached, he said, "Who are you?" Daniel felt his stomach tighten, but he didn't look away. "My name is Daniel," he said evenly. "Daniel Carter." He let the words hang in the air for a moment before adding, "Your son." James didn't react right away. His fingers, which had been resting on his laptop keyboard, curled slightly. His jaw tensed, but his expression remained carefully composed. "I don't have a son," he said coolly. Daniel let out a small, bitter laugh. "Yeah," he said. "I figured you'd say that." He took a step closer, refusing to let James dismiss him so easily. "You left my mother when she was pregnant. You threw her out of your house like she was nothing. She raised me alone, worked herself to the bone so I could have a life. And all this time, you've been sitting here in your empire, pretending we don't exist." James exhaled slowly as if trying to gather his thoughts. He stood up from his chair, moving around the desk with measured steps. Up close, Daniel could see the faint hesitation in his eyes, a flicker of something he couldn't quite define. "Emily Carter," James murmured, almost to himself. That was her name. He looked at Daniel again, and this time, there was something more than cold detachment in his gaze. There was recognition. "She never tried to contact me," he said. Daniel clenched his fists. "Why would she?" he shot back. "You made it clear she wasn't welcome in your life. You threw her out with nothing. She didn't come crawling back because she had dignity. And she didn't need you. James let out a breath, rubbing a hand over his face. For the first time he looked tired. Not the exhaustion of a businessman, but something deeper. Something heavier. You shouldn't be here, he said finally. Daniel's heart pounded with anger. What? Because it's inconvenient for you? Because it ruins the perfect life you've built for yourself? He shook his head, his voice laced with frustration. I didn't come here looking for money. I don't want anything from you. I just wanted to see you face to face. To understand how a man could walk away from his own child and never look back. James was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. You think it was easy? He turned away, walking toward the window. You think I haven't thought about it? Daniel stared at him in disbelief. If you thought about it, you sure didn't do anything about it. James let out a bitter chuckle. And what would you have wanted me to do? I was young, ambitious. I wasn't ready to be a father. He turned back to face Daniel, his eyes hard. And if I had reached out? If I had tried to be part of your life? Would Emily have let me? Daniel hesitated. He knew his mother had never spoken about wanting James back in their lives. But that didn't excuse what James had done. You didn't even try, Daniel said quietly. That's the difference. James studied him, and for the first time, there was something almost resembling regret in his expression. You're right, he admitted. I didn't. Daniel took a deep breath. He had come here for answers, and maybe he had gotten them, just not the ones he wanted. His father wasn't a monster. He was just a man. A flawed, selfish man who had made a decision years ago and never looked back. And maybe that was worse. I don't know what I expected, Daniel said, shaking his head. I guess I just needed to see it for myself. He turned toward the door, ready to leave. But before he could step out, James spoke again. Daniel. Daniel paused, his hand on the doorknob. He didn't turn around. James hesitated for a fraction of a second before saying, What does your mother think about you being here? Daniel's grip on the doorknob tightened. He turned his head slightly, just enough to meet James's gaze. She doesn't know, he admitted. But I think she stopped thinking about you a long time ago. And with that, he walked out of the office, leaving James Crawford standing alone in his empire, staring at the son he never knew he had. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. Daniel stepped out of the towering Crawford Enterprises building and into the cool autumn air of Manhattan, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. The conversation with James had left him feeling empty, like he had been searching for something that didn't even exist. He had imagined this moment for years, fantasized about confronting the man who had abandoned him and his mother, but the reality had been far less dramatic. His father wasn't some heartless villain, nor was he a remorseful man seeking redemption. He was just a businessman who had made a decision and lived with it. No apologies, no attempts to explain, just a cold acknowledgement of the past. It was almost worse than being outright rejected, because at least rejection came with some level of passion. This, however, was indifference, and that stung in a way Daniel hadn't been prepared for. He walked aimlessly through the busy streets, the honking of taxis and chatter of pedestrians blending into white noise around him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it. He knew it was his mother, wondering why he hadn't called her back. She had no idea he was here, and he wasn't sure how to tell her. Would she be angry? Disappointed? Or would she simply shake her head and say, I told you so? Daniel wasn't ready for any of those reactions. He needed time to process everything first. Eventually, he found himself in Central Park, where he sat on a bench overlooking the lake. The crisp air carried the scent of fallen leaves, and joggers passed by, lost in their own worlds. He thought about his mother, about the sacrifices she had made to give him a decent life. She had worked 2 jobs, often coming home late and exhausted, yet she never once let him feel like he was missing out. Every birthday, every school event, every scraped knee, she had been there. And the man who had given him life? He had been nowhere. Pulling out his phone, Daniel finally checked his messages. As expected, there were several missed calls from his mother, along with a few texts. One in particular caught his attention. Call me. It's important. His stomach tightened as he hesitated for a moment before dialing her number. She picked up on the first ring. Daniel, she breathed, relief evident in her voice. Where have you been? I've been trying to reach you all day. Sorry, Mom, he said, rubbing his forehead. I just needed some time to think. There was a pause on the other end. Where are you? She asked carefully. In the city, he admitted. He didn't want to lie to her, but he also wasn't sure how much to reveal just yet. His mother was silent for a moment, and then she said, You went to see him, didn't you? Daniel exhaled slowly. Yeah. A long silence followed. When she finally spoke again, her voice was softer, almost resigned. I thought you might, eventually. He frowned. You're not mad. She let out a quiet laugh, though it lacked any real amusement. Mad? No, Daniel. I knew this day would come. I just hoped. I don't know. Maybe I hoped you wouldn't have to go looking for answers that won't satisfy you. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I don't know what I expected, but he didn't care, Mom. He didn't even try to pretend he felt guilty. He just accepted it. Like leaving us behind was just another business decision. His mother sighed. That's who he is, sweetheart. That's who he always was. Did you ever try to reach out to him? Daniel asked hesitantly. She was quiet for a long time before answering. No, she admitted. I was young, heartbroken, and too proud to beg someone to love their own child. And honestly, I didn't want him in your life if he didn't want to be there. You deserved better than that. Daniel felt a lump in his throat. You never told me much about him, he said. Only that he left. I didn't want you to grow up with hate in your heart, she said simply. He made his choice and I made mine. My choice was to make sure you never felt unwanted. Daniel swallowed hard. You did, Mom. You were enough. There was silence on the line, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. That's all I ever wanted to hear. For the first time that day, Daniel felt a sense of clarity. Maybe he hadn't needed to meet James to find closure. Maybe the answers had been with him all along, in the form of the woman who had given him everything despite having nothing. He stood up, looking around the park one last time before saying, I'm coming home. His mother exhaled in relief. I'll be here. Hanging up, Daniel took one last deep breath before heading toward the subway. He had spent years searching for something. Justice, acknowledgement, maybe even revenge, but in the end, none of that mattered. His mother was right. He hadn't needed James Crawford. He never had. And now, finally, he could start living like he believed it. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. Daniel sat in the quiet of his small apartment in Brooklyn, staring at the dim glow of the city lights outside his window. His meeting with James Crawford had left a strange void inside him, one he wasn't sure how to fill. He had spent years imagining how it would go, perhaps an explosive confrontation where his father finally admitted his mistakes, or a dramatic reconciliation where James expressed regret and begged for forgiveness. But reality had been cold, indifferent. No anger, no guilt, just a detached acknowledgement of the past. It was almost as if Daniel's existence had been nothing more than an insignificant footnote in the man's life. The realization stung, but in an odd way it was also liberating. His entire childhood had been spent wondering what he had done to make his father leave, what flaw in him had made him unworthy of love. But now he saw the truth. James's absence had nothing to do with him. It had always been about his father's own selfishness. And knowing that meant Daniel could finally stop blaming himself. He picked up his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he landed on his mother's number. He had already spoken to her after the meeting, but something inside him needed to hear her voice again. He hesitated for a moment before calling, and she answered almost immediately. Daniel, she said warmly, the familiar comfort in her tone washing over him. Hey Mom, he said, his voice softer than he intended. I just wanted to check in. She chuckled lightly. Sweetheart, you don't have to check in on me. I'm the mother, remember? I check in on you. A small smile tugged at his lips. Yeah, well, I just wanted to hear your voice. She paused as if sensing the weight behind his words. Are you okay? Daniel leaned back against the couch, running a hand through his hair. I don't know. I thought meeting him would bring me some kind of closure, but it just feels empty. His mother sighed. That's because closure doesn't come from other people, Daniel. It comes from within. James wasn't going to give you anything you didn't already have. Daniel closed his eyes, letting her words sink in. You were right about him. About everything. There was a silence on the other end before she said, I never wanted to be right about this, sweetheart. I would have given anything for him to be the father you deserved. His chest tightened. You were enough, Mom. You always were. A soft sniffle came through the line, and he knew she was holding back tears. Thank you, baby. That means more than you know. They talked for a while longer, reminiscing about old memories, laughing at stories from his childhood. By the time they hung up, Daniel felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. Maybe he hadn't found the closure he was looking for, but he had found something even more valuable, the realization that he had never truly been alone. As the days passed, he focused on work, pouring himself into his projects. He was a financial analyst at a small firm, far from the wealth and power his father wielded, but he was proud of the life he had built. He had worked hard for everything he had without shortcuts or handouts, and that was something James Crawford could never take away from him. One afternoon, while grabbing coffee at a cafe near Wall Street, he ran into an old college friend, Michael. They hadn't spoken in years, but after catching up over coffee, Michael mentioned a business opportunity, an investment startup that was looking for sharp minds like Daniel's. At first, Daniel hesitated. He had a stable job, a steady paycheck. But there was something exciting about the idea of building something from the ground up, of proving to himself that he could succeed on his own terms. After a few sleepless nights of weighing his options, he decided to take the leap. He quit his job and joined Michael's startup, throwing himself into long hours and endless meetings. The work was exhausting but fulfilling. He was building something real, something that wasn't tied to his past or his father's name. Months turned into a year, and Daniel found himself thriving. The startup had taken off, securing funding and expanding rapidly. He had built a reputation for himself in the industry, not as James Crawford's son, but as Daniel, a self-made man who had earned his success through sheer determination. One evening, as he was preparing for a major investors' meeting, he received an unexpected email. It was from a journalist working on a feature about successful entrepreneurs with unique backgrounds. The email mentioned James Crawford, hinting that the journalist knew about Daniel's connection to him. His stomach twisted at the thought of his past being dragged into the spotlight. For a long time he stared at the screen, debating whether to respond. Finally he took a deep breath and typed a reply. He kept it simple and to the point. I have no connection to James Crawford. My story is my own. And for the first time in his life he truly believed it. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. Daniel had always believed that success would bring him peace, that once he had carved out a life independent of his father's shadow, he would feel whole. But even as his startup flourished and his name gained recognition in New York's financial circles, a quiet restlessness lingered inside him. No matter how much he accomplished, a part of him still carried the wounds of his past. The truth was, no amount of success could rewrite the years of abandonment, the sleepless nights his mother had endured, or the questions that had haunted him for decades. He had fought so hard to distance himself from James Crawford, yet the man's existence still had a hold over him in ways he couldn't ignore. One evening, after wrapping up a long meeting, Daniel found himself aimlessly walking through Central Park. The city lights flickered through the trees, and the crisp autumn air carried a hint of nostalgia. He pulled out his phone, debating whether to call his mother. He hadn't spoken to her in a few days, and though he knew she never expected constant updates, he always felt guilty when too much time passed between their conversations. As he hesitated, his phone vibrated with an unknown number. Normally he ignored such calls, but something compelled him to answer. "Hello," he said cautiously. There was a pause, followed by a deep voice. "Daniel?" His breath caught in his throat. He knew that voice. Older, rougher than he remembered, but unmistakable. James Crawford. Daniel's grip tightened around the phone. "How did you get my number?" James sighed. "I have my ways. I figured it was time we talked." A bitter laugh escaped Daniel's lips. "You figured? After 20 years, you just decided now is the right time?" "I know I don't deserve a warm welcome," James admitted, his tone unusually subdued. "But I saw the article about your company. You've done well for yourself." Daniel's jaw clenched. "I did it without you." "I know." There was another pause. "Look, I don't expect you to care, but I'm not in the best shape these days. Health-wise." A wave of conflicting emotions surged through Daniel. Part of him wanted to tell James he didn't care, that whatever happened to him was his own problem. But another part of him, the part that still sought answers, couldn't ignore the gravity in his father's voice. "What do you want?" he asked, keeping his tone cold. "To see you," James said simply. "One conversation. That's all I'm asking." Daniel hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away, to let the past stay buried. But there was something unsettling about the way James sounded, as if this might be his only chance to get the closure he had been chasing his entire life. "Fine," Daniel said. "One conversation. But I choose the place." James agreed without hesitation, and they arranged to meet the next evening at a quiet restaurant in Manhattan. Daniel spent the entire night tossing and turning, questioning whether he was making a mistake. But when morning came, he knew he had to go through with it. The restaurant was nearly empty when he arrived, his nerves on edge as he scanned the room. Then he saw him, James Crawford, sitting at a corner table. The man looked different from the last time Daniel had seen him. His once powerful frame had thinned, his face lined with age and something deeper, regret perhaps. Daniel sat across from him, keeping his expression unreadable. So talk. James took a deep breath. I've made a lot of mistakes. I won't make excuses for them. But leaving you and your mother, that was the worst one. Daniel scoffed. You don't get to say that now. You had 20 years to fix it. James nodded. You're right. And I don't expect forgiveness. But I do want to explain. He looked down at his hands as if gathering his thoughts. When your mother got pregnant, I was terrified. Not of fatherhood, but of losing the life I had built. My career, my status. I was selfish. I thought I could erase my mistakes by running from them. Daniel's chest tightened. You didn't just run. You destroyed us. My mother struggled for years while you lived in luxury. I know, James said quietly. And I've regretted it every day. He exhaled slowly. I tried to convince myself I was doing you a favor by staying away. That you'd be better off without me. But the truth is I was a coward. Daniel stared at him, searching for sincerity in his father's eyes. He had imagined this conversation countless times, but none of his imagined scenarios had prepared him for this. A man stripped of arrogance, admitting his failures without pretense. So why now? Daniel finally asked. Why reach out after all this time? James hesitated. Because I don't have much time left. He pulled back his sleeve slightly, revealing the hospital bracelet beneath it. Stage 4 cancer. Doctors say I have months, maybe less. Daniel's heart pounded. He had spent his whole life hating this man, resenting him for the pain he had caused. And now he was being told that James Crawford, the father he had never really known, was dying. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, What do you want from me? James met his gaze. Not money. Not pity. Just a chance to know my son before it's too late. Daniel felt something inside him crack, the walls he had built so carefully over the years beginning to shake. He didn't know if he could ever forgive James. He didn't know if he even wanted to. But something told him that walking away now wouldn't make the pain disappear. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. Daniel sat in the quiet of his New York apartment, staring at the city skyline through the large glass windows. The meeting with his father had left him in turmoil, a mix of anger, confusion, and something he wasn't ready to name yet. He had always believed that if he ever saw James Crawford again, he would feel nothing but hatred. He had imagined the confrontation so many times, him standing tall, successful, throwing his achievements in his father's face, making him regret every moment he had chosen to abandon them. But reality had been far more complicated. His father was a dying man, stripped of his arrogance, facing the end of his life with the weight of his regrets pressing down on him. And that changed everything. The next few days were restless. Daniel buried himself in work, attending meetings, handling investments, anything to keep his mind from wandering back to James. But no matter how much he tried to push it away, the thought remained. His father was dying, and he had only a small window of time to decide whether to let him go with unanswered questions or to allow himself the chance to know the man who had shaped his life through absence. His mother, Olivia, had called him, sensing something was wrong. She didn't know yet about the meeting, and Daniel wasn't sure how to bring it up. She had been through enough. But a part of him needed to hear her voice, needed to be reminded of the woman who had raised him without ever looking back. On the third night after meeting James, Daniel found himself driving through the streets of Manhattan, his thoughts pulling him toward the hospital where James was receiving treatment. He didn't know what he was doing or why he was going there, but something in him refused to let go. When he arrived, he found James in a small hospital room, sitting up in bed, his once powerful frame now fragile. The older man looked genuinely surprised to see him, his weary eyes lighting up for just a moment. I didn't think you'd come back, James admitted, his voice raspier than before. Daniel hesitated before stepping inside. I don't know why I did, he admitted truthfully. James motioned to the chair beside his bed, and after a long pause, Daniel sat. There was a heavy silence between them, filled with years of unanswered questions. Finally, Daniel spoke. Tell me the truth. About everything. And for the first time in his life, James Crawford did. He spoke of his childhood, of growing up in a world where wealth meant power and emotions were a weakness. He talked about how he had met Olivia, how he had loved her in his own selfish way but had been too afraid to lose control over his perfectly constructed life. He admitted that when she had told him she was pregnant, he had panicked. He had told himself that leaving was the only option, that being a father would destroy the empire he had built. He had convinced himself it was for the best. But deep down he had always known the truth. He had abandoned them not out of necessity but out of fear. Daniel listened, his emotions a storm inside him. He had spent his life believing his father had never cared, but now he saw something else. A man who had been broken long before he had even been born. And as much as he wanted to hold on to his anger, he couldn't ignore the pain in James's voice, the regret etched into every word. "I don't expect you to forgive me," James said finally, his voice trembling. "I just didn't want to leave this world without you knowing how sorry I am." Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. He had spent years waiting for this apology, but now that it was here, he realized it didn't erase the past. It didn't change what his mother had suffered, what he had endured growing up without a father. But maybe it could change something else. Maybe it could allow him to move forward without the weight of resentment pulling him down. The following weeks passed in a blur. Daniel found himself visiting James more often, their conversations growing deeper. They talked about business, about life, about the years they had lost. It wasn't easy and it wasn't perfect, but it was something. Olivia was hesitant when Daniel finally told her, but she didn't stop him. She had made her peace with the past, and she trusted Daniel to make his own choices. One evening, as Daniel sat by James's hospital bed, the older man looked at him with tired but peaceful eyes. "I never got to be your father," he said. "But in these last few weeks you gave me a chance to be something close." Daniel felt a tightness in his chest. He had never called James Dad, and he probably never would. But in that moment he reached out and squeezed his father's hand. It was the closest thing to forgiveness he could offer. James Crawford passed away 2 days later. His will left everything to Daniel, not just his wealth but his personal journals, letters he had written but never sent, pieces of a man he had never truly known. At first, Daniel didn't know what to do with it all. But as time passed, he found himself reading through the pages, understanding his father in ways he never had before. Months later, as he stood in his office, looking out at the city he had built his life in, he realized something. He had spent years chasing success to prove a point, to prove that he didn't need his father. But now, for the first time, he was no longer running. He was moving forward, not in defiance of his past but in acceptance of it.